Ahunna Eziakonwa, it's such a pleasure and privilege to have you on the NABA Perspectives podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lanre. It's great to be here.
Now, we want to talk about Africa's changing role in world affairs. We want to talk about multilateralism for a changing world order. But before we do that, let's take a step back and tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your work, where Africa fits into the picture for you, and just why this is an important time for the continent.
Yeah, so my name is Ahunna, which means the body of the father. And today I remember actually my dad, my late father, for giving me this name because it was his way of saying that he's putting a lot of currency in his girl children because he had many of us girls. And I think that got me started actually to that validation from a parent saying, you are a girl, not valued normally by society at the same level as boys, but I value you. And I think you're going to go on and do great things. So I have always had that confidence that, I'm worth it. And that sort of led to also my understanding what Africa should mean, because Africa produced me. I did all my schooling in Nigeria, which is my home country. Now, I was born during the Biafran War. And my parents, young parents at the time, survived the war with all of us. So I also started to see the ingredients that, Africans are made of, because I'm really baffled sometimes at how they went through that conflict, pulled through, sent all of us to school with very little support. So the resilience of Africa, the compassion of Africa, that sort of hard-working spirit, and the belief in a life of prosperity is also what's driven me. I started in the UN working for the humanitarian part of the organization, and soon realized that we need to tackle root causes. So that led me into UN development program because I felt, we can't just be cleaning up, after the fact. We need to prevent these events in the first place and put Africa on a stronger footing in terms of its development pathway. So that's how I kind of arrived at development work.
And the prophecy has been fulfilled. You have gone on to do big things. I mean, you're now an Assistant Secretary General. You run the UNDP's Africa Department, and that's not to brag, but to make the point that you are in a position where you have a strong understanding of what is happening globally, what's happening in terms of development and multilateralism in particular, the UN being the ultimate multilateral body that we have out there, and where Africa fits into that. It's a difficult time in many ways at the moment. We know that there's a lot more tension in the world, there's a lot more division in the world than we have seen for a very long time now. There's even talk of a return to bloc politics and a new Cold War, and there's more increasing voices saying, why do we need the UN? Do we need the UN? None of that is particularly encouraging. Quite alarming, right?
Yes, UNDP publishes this annual report, which we call the Human Development Report. And 2 years ago, there was actually one that looked at this. What you describe is the increasing polarization of the world. And there was one phrase that caught my attention when we saw the report. It says that we're living in an era where we're mismanaging our interdependence. So it's really recognizing that the world is so much more interdependent. COVID showed us just how interdependent we are as a global community. But all of this interdependence is being mismanaged at various fronts when we talk about climate change and the impact we have on the planet and how we need to come together to sustain the future. When it comes to pandemics, and how we saw the vaccine nationalism that grew out of that, even when we knew that nowhere is safe unless we were all safe, When it comes to even the geopolitics, the conflicts around the world and the divisions that are created where, nations back in conflict rather than coming together behind peace. So there are all manner, when it comes to energy transitions, and all of these kind of mismanagement continues to sort of create mistrust. And what happens when you don't trust the other is fear. So the politics of fear. But I don't think it all means that multilateralism is dying. I think multilateralism is evolving. And we're getting now other, kind of a diversity of power bases and interest groups that will reshape multilateralism. And the Summit of the Future, which just happened, I think is the first in that step to say, we need each other more than ever before. But listen, the systems that were created for the grandparents cannot be the same ones that address the needs for the grandchildren. So we need reform of the system. And so for me, it's a rebirth of multilateralism that's needed. It's reshaping multilateralism so that all of these consequences that we see, first we will have healing, but also the root causes, the things that led to this deep division, come from the flawed systems, international systems that are constructed. The global financial system, the whole, architecture needs to be reformed. What we do with issues around digitalization cannot be one part of the world governing the digital future. That's dangerous. So you need to bring more voices around the table. The Security Council. And also during this Pact for the Future, there were more voices saying a continent like Africa should be a permanent member of the Security Council, because 25% of Security Council decisions and discussions are on a region that is not represented.
Yes, look, if we're honest, it's absurd that in 2024 that there is no Africa in the United Nations Security Council. And, to maybe understate it, the world has changed a little bit since 1945, right. But the institutions haven't. Look, I agree with you that multilateralism may be under assault in a way, but far from, I think, sort of making the UN less relevant, I would say it's making it more important than ever.
Correct.
Right? That the United Nations Charter is something that is taken seriously, and that the UN continues to be the venue where, no matter what is happening, the world still, ultimately sits down in a room together. Mm-hmm. The key question, of course, is how that evolution happens, which you've touched on, and you've mentioned the Pact for the Future, which of course has just recently been launched. Africa has taken a leading role in bringing that together, in convening the world around that, and it is an effort to push back and say, no, this is not the time to start splintering and fracturing. What do you say to skeptics who will look at the UN and say, come on, the UN is always producing things like this and always saying things like this. This is just another declaration. Nobody's going to take this seriously. Nobody's going to respect that. Something I'm sure you hear from a lot of people. What's your response to people who sort of like, roll their eyes at this or maybe kind of want to dismiss it?
I sympathize because, listen, there is some validation of that because we have had many broken promises. Let's be honest, when the world gathered in Paris to talk about climate finance, promises were made that were not kept. We have, in the Africa region today, which doesn't contribute a significant amount to global warming, you have countries that are devastated by the impact of climate change. And yet it took how many years for the world to actually agree that there should be such a thing as a loss and damage fund. But even as we speak, no African country is seen assent of that. I mean, there's been a commitment made, and countries are asking, from Mozambique to Sierra Leone, when they have these devastating extreme weather issues, who is there to actually not come to a rescue, but to support, to express solidarity in concrete terms, so that they don't have to borrow money to clean up the impact of climate change, which is what many countries are doing today, because the effects are wiping development gains left, right, and center, creating conditions that, even further tighten the fiscal situation of countries. And yet there isn't really a lot of support that's going into that. So when people doubt the, genuineness of these, you kind of sympathize. But I hope, and some of us are quite, we have stubborn hope. You don't give up, because giving up is really not the answer. That this time, that we're going from promise to practice. And what I think gives me some confidence that it's going to be different is just the level of desperation of the world when it comes to how unsustainable we have become as a global community. And the fact also that insecurity is now felt globally. It isn't anymore an emotion that belongs to the Sahel region or to Sudan or to Ukraine. I think everywhere people feel this deep sense of insecurity and fear about the uncertain. There is no certainty about the future. So I think that is really igniting.
There's a sense of urgency, right?
Yeah, there is that sense of urgency, which I hope will push some of these decisions in the direction of action. The other thing I think is the voice of young people, because this Pact for the Future was very much about future generations and the young. And I think that declaration, which we've never really had before, for the young generation, for the future generation, and giving them the platform and that empowerment to have agency, to have skin in the game, could push us again in the direction of action, because young people are fierce in their honesty, and they are also quite ingenious in their own creative minds that are coming up with solutions. And we see this a lot in Africa. So I'm hopeful.
And I guess when we talk about multilateralism being under attack, it's important also to be quite nuanced about that, because most of the world doesn't want to retreat from multilateralism. Actually, it's certain centers of power, and the major powers obviously have pivotal roles to play in that, but it's not as though everybody everywhere is sort of throwing their hands up and saying we don't want to integrate and cooperate. I guess the challenge is, when the big powers are pushing or pulling in the wrong direction, it makes it that much harder for everyone else to meaningfully go after these things. Now, in terms of Africa and Africa's role in helping to drive the emergence of a new type of multilateralism, one that is actually fit for purpose for the 21st century, which in principle, who can argue against that? Why would you not want a multilateralism that works for all of the world instead of a small part of the world? Do you think that there is an underestimation? Because on the surface, you look at it and you think, well, what influence could African countries realistically have? Look at their GDP. Look at this. We know the list, the checklist of reasons why Africa doesn't have the influence. Do you think that there's an underestimation of the leverage and the potential influence the continent actually has, not just externally, but maybe even more importantly, internally? Do you think that Africa maybe underestimates itself in terms of the potential leverage it has when it comes to influencing some of these international decisions that are made?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think there is a weight of the sort of colonial mindset that has dominated Africa's view of itself and its relationship with the world that needs to be lifted. And maybe that's not going to happen overnight, but I think it certainly plays a big role in the emergence of Africa's role on the global stage. It's starting to come. You're starting to hear more assertive voices from the continent. You're starting to see countries that are increasingly looking at their value proposition, and whether it's in renewable energy capacity, in the demographic, the fact that this is now emerging as the youngest continent. This is a place where the heart will continue to beat now, even as other regions start to suffer aging populations and needing to, look for a workforce on the continent. So I think Africa's value to the future is starting to emerge in the minds of African leaders and Africans, but it's way too slow. And as doors start to open to platforms like the G20, Africa needs to work even harder to understand what it has to offer and the need for it to claim that agency and that voice in those places. It's really the difference between going from being on the menu to being the chef.
Well put. And look, it's the point you make is fundamental. But of course, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but you make that point with eyes wide open, in that there's no naivety about it. What we're talking about here it's difficult, it's complicated potentially, but I guess the bottom line is it's absolutely necessary for that mindset to change, because a more confident Africa can only be a positive influence on the world. Especially.
Well, we always say the Africa we want is the Africa the world needs. Yeah. And I think this is so true. At this meeting, for instance, your summit here, it's been so clear that indeed the world needs Africa. Is the world to Africa and Africa to the world, in a way. And it's a new conversation. We're starting to see countries like Norway, like Denmark, that have partnerships with Africa redefine the narrative they have. Denmark's Africa strategy talks about Africa's century, for instance. There is a recognition already here, and Africa needs to match that with its own internal reflection on what it means, to operate now at this level. And it's not easy, but it must happen. And it's an evolution in a way that has to happen at all levels of society, not just state level, but also civil society, universities, Africa's researchers, and opinion makers have to get involved in really cultivating this confidence, without which Africa will still not be taken seriously.
I'd like to disagree, but you're absolutely correct on that point. Unless that mindset changes, unless the attitude changes and the self-perception changes, it will always be an uphill struggle.
Yeah.
One last question, if you don't mind, before we wrap up, and it's always dangerous to try to predict the future. I would say it's more dangerous than ever right now to try to predict. So I'm not going to ask you to predict the future, but over the next 5 to 10 years, what would you like to see happen in terms of not only the emergence of a new multilateralism, but more to the point, Africa's contribution to that?
It's interesting. When we talk about multilateralism, I actually think it's in the DNA of Africa. Because I think historically the way Africa emerged as a region required that it embrace multilateralism, because no one country, the way Africa is chopped up, is going to be able to make it without some kind of integration. So regional integration has been very important to Africa. The African Union emerged from that reflection. And what Africa did during COVID when countries were retreating from each other, Africa actually was embracing each other. I don't know if you remember the solidarity flights that Ethiopian Airlines just sort of launched to get PPEs to
I remember them very
several
well.
countries.
Very well.
And Africa Union coming together, the CDC, looking at issues around vaccine and how to collectively deal with this, looking at productivity at home. Africa cannot continue to depend on the outside. For more than 70% of what it needs to sustain itself comes from outside the continent. And this was a rude awakening during COVID.
It was a wake-up call, wasn't it?
It was a wake-up call. And it's now, a question of how do you increase your resilience and reduce sort of that dependence. And I think that's important in terms of keeping the continent healthy and on its feet and able to contribute to global events, because you need to be strong in yourself and self-assured before you can actually step out and make a contribution. So that, I think that realization has been important. And so Africa needs to, in the next 5 years, needs to continue along that path of making sure that it's changing those structures that has kept it so dependent economically, politically, and socially on the outside world. I want to see that, because I think that's going to position Africa better in the future. In terms of multilateralism, I think, again, with that strength, Africa can really teach the world a lot about the values of multilateralism, because it's embedded in its own cultural heritage. I was talking earlier about the philosophy of Ubuntu, which is deep in most African cultures. That whole community, we're a community. And I think it's about time Africa started to talk about its values. And so, countries in Europe, for instance, make a lot of their values, the European values, There are African values that the world needs to actually shape the future, because those are values of compassion, those are values of community, of friendship, of hospitality. I mean, look at what's happening with the refugee crisis. Who is hosting millions of refugees today? African countries. I mean, I worked in Uganda. That country is hosting over 1 million refugees, and they are not complaining. Look at Chad, a country in its own crisis, hosting close to 1 million Sudanese and other refugees, and they're not complaining. So there is a lot, even today, in the way Africa is open to the world, in the way it enacts hospitality, solidarity, that can all be fed into the new multilateralism. And I think Africa just needs to confidently go there, because the world needs it.
A very compelling note to end on. Ahunna, thank you so much for taking the time out and having this conversation with us today.
Pleasure, Larry. Thanks for having me.